My wife's office affair destroyed her. Not me or our children. Welcome to Michael Tells Stories. Here, I share daily infidelity stories about unfaithful wives. Thank you for listening. The first thing I learned about betrayal is that it never arrives with thunder. It comes quietly, like dust settling in a familiar room. Unnoticed until you rub your fingers together and realize you've been breathing it for far too long. And that morning in our kitchen smelled of lemon dish soap and stale coffee grounds. Pale winter light slicing through the blinds in soft stripes while I stood at the counter spreading butter on toast with the same absent precision my father once had. Thinking only of lunches, schedules, and whether there was enough time before the bus came. Believing, foolishly, that safety was something you could build and keep if you were careful enough. Lily padded in first, 8 years old and already observant in a way that made me uneasy. Noah trailing behind her with the stubborn certainty of 5, arguing about crunchy peanut butter like it was a moral issue. And I smiled because loving them felt like an ache I welcomed. A constant reminder of what mattered most. And when Amelia's phone vibrated face down near the fruit bowl, Lily's eyes flicked toward it before mine did. Quick and cautious, as if she'd learned to listen for tension the way other children listened for thunder. And I brushed it off with a joke about the whole world wanting something from their mother before breakfast. Even as she didn't laugh and instead watched my hands like she needed proof I was steady. Amelia came down the stairs minutes later smelling of expensive shampoo and effort. Hair still damp, blouse ironed too carefully, looking exactly like the woman I married and yet not quite. Kissing the children automatically, brushing my shoulder in passing without stopping, flipping her phone over so the screen vanished from view in a movement so small it would have meant nothing if I hadn't known her so well. Telling me she was running late, that she'd already had coffee, that she'd be home late again because of work, saying don't start when I pointed out she'd said that last week. And Lily stopped chewing at that tone. Noah laughed at nothing, and when Amelia left with her keys jingling, the kitchen stayed the same but the air thinned. Lily staring at her plate as if she'd forgotten what food was for. I dropped them off, drove to my office with the radio low, telling myself all the reasonable things marriage teaches you to tell yourself: stress, deadlines, exhaustion, building explanations the way you build furniture, sanding edges, tightening screws, refusing to see the rot, answering Amelia's midday text about permission slips and dry cleaning with a simple yes because anything else would have required admitting I was hurt. And hurt had become complicated between us. At pickup, Noah burst with pride about being line leader. Lily admitted quietly she'd missed one spelling word out of 20 like it was a failure. And at a red light she asked if Mom was mad at me. Not looking at my face. And I smoothed the surface instead of opening the box because parents lie sometimes out of fear. Promising pasta and stories and a good night. Evening settled into its familiar rhythm, shoes abandoned, pencil shavings on the table, detergent in the air, and the kids kept glancing at the door as if time itself might knock. And when Amelia finally came home near 8, she praised them distractedly. Said she wasn't hungry, stood in her coat scrolling her phone, telling me please when I asked her to sit. Not in front of them. Always them, like our children were an audience instead of the center of our lives. And when she stepped closer, I smelled a cologne that didn't belong to me or our house. my body understanding what my mind tried to reject. And I asked quietly who he was. Watched her deny too fast. Call me paranoid. Exhausting. Watched Lily lower the cartoon volume with the calm of a child trained for emergencies. Noah freezing mid-bite, and I sent them down the hall before my anger could fill the room. Choosing containment over explosion. Choosing them. Alone. Emilia stood ready to flee. Coat still on. And when she said his name was Julian. From her office. Since the fall. The word geometry of our life shifted. Memories rearranging themselves into something ugly and undeniable. And when she admitted she was sleeping with him, the world didn't end. It narrowed, focusing on the sound of my son's laugh down the hall and the knowledge that whatever she'd done, I had to be the adult who kept the air breathable. I told her not tonight. Told her to read to the kids. To act like a mother. Because structure exposes what chaos hides. And she panicked at that calm more than she would have at screaming. Lipstick, not her shade, smeared on her coat collar. Proof I refused to point out. And later, after Lily asked if grown-ups stop loving each other and I told her children are never the reason. After Noah demanded one more story and kiss like he always did when something felt wrong. I found Emilia on the bed staring at her phone like it was both lifeline and weapon. And I told her to put it down. Watched her argue that if she didn't answer he would worry. Watched shame and anger flicker across her face when I named what he was. And when she whispered she hadn't wanted to be this person, I understood how easily comfort could become permission. How forgiveness offered too early rots into silence. And I told her to stop. To start with the phone. And when she finally set it face down on the nightstand, I felt no victory. Only the weight of a long road ahead. Knowing the days to come would carve us with truth and consequence. Knowing too that whatever this affair destroyed, it would not be me and it would not be our children. And if it destroyed her, it would be because she refused to climb out. Not because I pushed. And when I sat across from her and said, "Tell me everything," her fear finally looked honest. And I understood that this was not the end but the beginning. That dignity is not dramatic. It is disciplined. And that love is not begging someone to stay but building a life where your children can breathe. She took a long breath after I said, "Tell me everything." The kind of breath people take when they are about to step into cold water knowing it will shock them. And when she finally spoke, her voice sounded unfamiliar to both of us. Stripped of the sharpness she used like armor at work. Stripped of the impatience she wore at home. Softer but not kinder. Just exposed. And she told me how Julian had started as a harmless conversation during late meetings. How he listened in a way that felt flattering. How he noticed her exhaustion and framed it as brilliance instead of burden. How he made her feel seen at a time when she had decided, quietly and unfairly, that I no longer did. And as she spoke, I realized something painful and grounding at the same time. That her story centered entirely on her feelings. Her hunger. Her fear of aging. Her resentment at responsibility. And that our children appeared in it only as background noise. Obstacles to be managed. Never as people who would bleed from her choices. I listened without interrupting. Not because I was noble, but because interruption would have given her something to fight against. And I wanted the truth unarmed. Wanted to hear it without distortion. And when she said she hadn't meant for it to go so far, that it had just happened, I asked her calmly how many times something has to happen before it becomes a decision. And she cried then. Real tears. Messy and human. Saying she felt trapped. Saying she didn't know how to stop without blowing up her life. And I thought of Lily lowering the volume. Of Noah clinging for one more kiss. And I understood with brutal clarity that Amelia was afraid of consequences. Not damage. Afraid of losing comfort. Not of hurting people. And that distinction mattered more than love ever could. We talked until after midnight. Voices low. Words heavy. The house holding our secrets in its walls. And when exhaustion finally forced us into silence, I slept on the couch not as punishment but as boundary. Staring at the ceiling and planning logistics with the same part of my brain that solved problems at work. Because grief had not yet arrived. Only resolve. The understanding that whatever happened next had to be deliberate. Morning came anyway. As it always does, indifferent and bright, and I woke before the alarm to make breakfast, to preserve ritual like a lifeline. And Amelia moved through the kitchen like a guest. Tentative, careful, too careful, trying to read my mood the way Lily read the weather. And the children noticed immediately. Because children always notice shifts adults pretend are invisible. Lily watched her mother with wary politeness. Noah sensed tension like static and grew louder. More demanding. And I stepped in gently. Redirecting. Grounding. Deciding in 1,000 small ways that today would not belong to the affair. That today would belong to math homework and shoes tied too slowly and peanut butter arguments. Because protecting childhood is not a speech. It is repetition. Amelia left for work again. Saying she would come straight home. Saying she would end it. And I nodded without promise because trust is not restored by words. It is rebuilt by patterns. And at my office I met with a lawyer during lunch. Not because I wanted divorce. Not yet. But because information is power and ignorance is vulnerability. And I learned quietly what custody would look like. What finances would look like. What protecting the children would require if Amelia chose chaos over repair. When she came home that evening she was shaken. Pale. Saying Julian hadn't taken it well. Saying he felt blindsided. Saying he accused her of leading him on. And I listened, again without sympathy. Because the man who sleeps with a married woman does not get to feel betrayed. And when she looked at me like she expected comfort, I said gently but firmly that his feelings were no longer my concern. That our children were. And something in her shifted then. Resentment flickering behind her eyes. Because being asked to prioritize others after choosing herself feels like punishment to people who mistake desire for need. The days that followed were a slow burn. Not explosive but corrosive. Filled with hard conversations after bedtime. With Amelia oscillating between remorse and defensiveness. Between promises to cut contact and irritation that I didn't instantly soften. And I held my line not with cruelty but with consistency. Sleeping separately, sharing schedules, attending Lily's school, meeting together like polite strangers. And the children adapted in their own ways. Noah becoming clingier, Lily becoming quieter. And I spoke to her teacher. Arranged counseling. Because silence is not strength when it comes to children. It is abandonment. One night, a week in, Amelia admitted she had seen Julian again. Just to talk, she said. Just closure. And something inside me went still. Not shattered. Just settled. Because that was the moment I understood she was not done choosing herself. And I told her then, calmly, that if she continued any contact, the separation would become physical, not emotional, that the kids and I would move to my sister's temporarily. And she accused me of controlling her, of punishing her, of using the children as leverage. Words people reach for when boundaries threaten their freedom. And I answered evenly that boundaries are not control. They are clarity, and that I would not negotiate safety for my children. She stared at me like she was seeing me for the first time. Not as a husband to manage, but as a father with teeth. And the next morning she packed a bag and left for her mother's house, saying she needed space, saying she felt suffocated, and I let her go without drama. Because chasing someone who is already halfway out the door only teaches your children that abandonment is something to beg against. The house felt quieter without her. Not peaceful, just steadier. And we settled into a new routine. Dinners simpler, evenings calmer, laughter returning in small, cautious increments. And Lily asked one night if Mom loved us. And I told her the truth without poison. That Mom loved them but was struggling to love responsibly. And that adults sometimes make choices that hurt people even when love is there. And Lily nodded like someone filing away a lesson she hadn't wanted yet. Weeks passed, then months. Therapy appointments, mediated conversations, Emilia swinging between guilt and anger, Julian fading slowly as reality replaced fantasy. And I watched my wife confront the wreckage of her own decisions, not with triumph but with sadness. Because watching someone destroy themselves is not satisfying when you once planned a future with them. Eventually she asked to come home. Said she had ended it. Said she wanted to try. And I agreed, not because I was desperate but because I believed in measured chances. In modeling effort without erasing consequence. And we rebuilt cautiously, with transparency, with counseling, with rules she sometimes resented. And over time the affair lost its heat, its romance shriveling under daylight and responsibility. And Emilia changed, not into a better person overnight, but into a more honest one. Forced to sit with shame instead of outsourcing it. Whether we stayed together forever was never the true question. The truth was simpler and harder. That I chose dignity every day. Chose my children's stability over my ego. Chose calm over chaos. And in doing so I taught them something Emilia could not at the time. That love does not excuse harm. That happiness does not require humiliation. And that when something breaks because of betrayal, it does not mean everyone must shatter with it. Because her affair destroyed her illusions, her arrogance, her sense of invulnerability, but it did not destroy me. And it did not destroy our children. And that, in the end, was the quiet victory no one sees coming. Time did what confrontation could not. It slowed everything down enough for truth to surface without being forced. And in that slowing I began to see Emilia not as my wife or my betrayer, but as a woman standing in the ruins of choices she could no longer rationalize away. Because once the secrecy ended and Julian faded into an embarrassing memory instead of a fantasy, what remained was not passion but consequence. And consequence is a lonely place when applause disappears. We lived together again, but carefully, like people sharing a space after a fire, testing each floorboard before trusting it with weight. And the children sensed the difference immediately. Noah relaxing into sleep again without calling for water. Lily asking questions directly instead of watching faces. And I realized how much energy they had been spending adapting to tension they never caused. Emilia tried hard in visible ways, packing lunches, showing up early, leaving her phone unlocked on the counter like an offering, but the deeper work was quieter and harder. Sitting through therapy sessions where she had to hear herself described without romance. Where the language shifted from mistake to pattern, from loneliness to entitlement. And I watched her flinch not because she was being attacked but because she was being accurately seen. There were days she grew defensive. Days she accused me of never letting it go. And on those days I reminded her calmly that trust does not return on a schedule. That remorse is not proven by discomfort but by endurance. And sometimes she cried, sometimes she went cold. But I no longer chased either response. Because my steadiness was not a strategy. It was a decision. What surprised me most was not her struggle but my own clarity. The way my love for her changed shape. Shedding urgency. Shedding fear. Becoming something conditional and self-respecting. Something that did not disappear when she was unhappy. Something that did not beg for approval. And in that shift I felt stronger. Not harder. Just more aligned with myself. One evening months later Lily asked if Mom was happier now. And Emilia froze, waiting. And I answered honestly that Mom was learning to be. That happiness built on secrecy collapses. And happiness built on responsibility takes time. And Emilia nodded slowly like someone accepting a sentence that could also be a release. Eventually she apologized to the children. Not with details, not with excuses, but with accountability, telling them she had been distracted and selfish and that it was not their fault. Telling them she was working to be better. And Lily accepted it with grace that broke my heart. Noah hugging her without analysis. Because children forgive faster than adults when they feel safe again. Whether our marriage would last was never guaranteed. But what did last was respect. And respect is a sturdier foundation than passion ever was. And in that space Emilia began to rebuild herself not as someone desired by a stranger but as someone worthy of her own children's trust. And if she succeeded it was because she chose humility over fantasy. And if she failed it would no longer take us down with her. I learned that love with dignity does not cling. It stands. It does not threaten. It protects. And as the years moved forward, quieter and steadier, I understood the truth hidden inside the pain. That her affair did not destroy our family. It revealed it, stripped away illusions, clarified roles, strengthened what was already rooted. And if Emilia remained with us it was because she earned her place anew. Not through suffering but through change. And if one day she chose to leave it would be without drama. Without shame. Without dragging our children through the wreckage. Because the real ending was never about whether she stayed. It was about how we lived afterward. With clarity. With boundaries. With compassion that did not erase accountability. And in that ending, gentle and earned, everyone kept their dignity. Especially her. Not because she was forgiven blindly. But because she finally chose to face herself and grow. What no one tells you about rebuilding after betrayal is that the loud part ends long before the real work does. That once the crisis passes and friends stop asking how you're holding up and routines return like furniture moved back into place. What's left is the quiet labor of becoming someone new without losing who you were. And that was where Amelia struggled the most. Not with guilt anymore, but with identity. Because the affair hadn't just been about desire. It had been about escape. About pretending she was someone unburdened by motherhood, by compromise, by the unglamorous repetition of commitment. And once that illusion collapsed, she had to face the life she'd tried to outrun. There were evenings when she sat at the dining table long after the kids were asleep, staring at nothing, and I knew she was grieving not Julian, but the version of herself who had felt limitless. And I didn't mock that grief or weaponize it. I simply didn't rescue her from it. Because some grief must be carried alone if it's going to teach anything. I focused instead on the children. On soccer practices and science projects. On showing up so consistently that safety became boring again. Because boring is what children deserve. And Amelia noticed, slowly, painfully, that the center of the household no longer revolved around her moods. That I no longer adjusted myself to keep her balanced. And that shift frightened her more than anger ever could. Because it meant she could not rely on me to absorb the consequences of her emotions. One night she asked me quietly if I still loved her. And I told her the truth. That I loved who she was becoming more than who she had been. That love without trust is sentiment, not partnership. And that I was willing to continue only if we were moving forward, not circling the same wound. And she nodded, not relieved, not offended, just sober, as if she finally understood the terms. Months later, when her company offered her a promotion that would require longer hours and travel, she turned it down without consulting Julian, without drama, without resentment toward me. And that was when I knew something fundamental had shifted. Because she had chosen alignment over validation, presence over praise, and she told Lily herself that she would be home more. That work mattered, but family mattered more. And Lily smiled cautiously, like someone testing ice with a toe. We were not suddenly happy in the cinematic sense. But we were real. And reality, I learned, has a steadier warmth than fantasy ever did. There were setbacks, moments when Amelia's shame surfaced as irritability, moments when my patience thinned. But we addressed them without spectacle, without rewriting history, without pretending scars didn't exist. And over time, the affair stopped being the defining chapter of our marriage and became instead a reference point. A line we did not cross again. Years later, watching Lily graduate, Noah lanky and confident beside her, Amelia reached for my hand not out of fear but out of shared pride. And in that simple gesture I felt no bitterness. Only a quiet gratitude for the man I had become by refusing to lose myself. For the children who grew up knowing that love has boundaries and strength. And for the woman beside me who had learned, at great cost, that desire without integrity destroys the person who chases it. Whether people called our story reconciliation or survival never mattered. Because the truth was simpler and harder. We chose dignity every day. We chose responsibility over romance. And in doing so, we proved something essential. That betrayal does not have to define the betrayed. That children do not have to inherit the consequences of adult selfishness. And that even the person who causes the damage can rebuild themselves if they are willing to face the wreckage honestly. And if they are not, they will still be the only one truly destroyed, while the rest of us move forward, intact, breathing freely. no longer living in the shadow of someone else's escape. What remained after everything settled was not triumph or romance or even certainty, but something quieter and more durable. A sense of authorship over my own life that I had never fully claimed before. And I realized that betrayal had not broken me open the way people warn it will. It had stripped me down to essentials. To the man who wakes up early to make breakfast, who listens more than he speaks, who understands that love without self-respect is just fear wearing a softer name. Amelia changed in ways that were not dramatic enough to impress strangers but deep enough to matter. She stopped explaining herself reflexively, stopped framing her pain as a defense, stopped asking for reassurance she had not earned, and instead learned how to sit with discomfort without outsourcing it to someone else's desire. And that growth was slow and uneven and sometimes invisible. But it was real, and it was hers. There came a point when we stopped talking about the affair altogether. Not because it was forbidden, but because it no longer had power. Because it had been examined, understood, integrated into the story instead of lurking like a ghost. And when Lily once asked, years later, how we stayed married when things got hard, Amelia answered before I could, saying that staying was not the brave part. Changing was. And I saw pride in my daughter's eyes, not because her parents were perfect but because they were honest. Noah grew into a boy who trusted his own footing, who didn't flinch at raised voices because there were fewer of them, who learned from watching us that men do not need to dominate to be strong. That strength can be calm, can be quiet, can look like walking away from chaos instead of feeding it. And I knew then that whatever scars the affair had left, they had not become inheritance. As for Amelia, there was a day she admitted something without prompting. That the affair had not been about love or excitement or even dissatisfaction with me. It had been about her inability to tolerate ordinariness. Her fear that a life built on responsibility meant the end of her relevance. And saying it out loud stripped it of its drama, reduced it to what it always was: immaturity dressed as rebellion. And she said she was grateful I had not begged her to stay. Grateful I had forced her to confront herself instead of hiding behind my forgiveness. And I listened without savoring the apology, without reopening wounds. Because forgiveness is not a victory lap. It is a state of being you enter when resentment no longer serves you. I forgave her not to save the marriage but to free myself. To model for my children that healing does not require forgetting, only releasing the need to punish. And whether our marriage continued or not became almost secondary to the life we were building. One grounded in mutual accountability instead of fantasy. There were still moments of doubt. Moments when I imagined a life alone. Quieter, simpler. And I allowed those thoughts without guilt because commitment chosen freely must always be allowed to be questioned. And Amelia sensed that too. Understanding finally that staying was a choice renewed daily. Not a prize she was entitled to. In the end, what defined us was not that an affair happened, but that it failed to consume everything else. It failed to erase the father I was, the children they were becoming, the woman Amelia had the capacity to be when she stopped running. And the life we chose afterward was not perfect or romantic or impressive. It was simply honest, and honesty, I learned, is the most underrated form of happiness. If someone were to ask me now whether the affair destroyed my marriage, I would say no. It destroyed illusions, arrogance, entitlement, and the belief that you can take love for granted without cost. And those are things worth losing. Because what survived was stronger, cleaner, built with intention instead of assumption. And as I watched my children move confidently into their own lives, unburdened by secrets that were never theirs to carry, I knew with certainty that whatever Amelia had risked, whatever she had nearly lost, the one thing she could never destroy was the core of who we were. Because we refused to let her choices define us. And that refusal, steady and unglamorous, was the true happy ending. The years that followed did not announce themselves as redemption. They arrived quietly, marked by ordinary milestones that once would have felt insignificant, but now carried weight because they were earned. Because nothing about our life together was assumed anymore. And in that assumption's absence, something sturdier took its place. Amelia and I learned how to disagree without turning conflict into warfare. How to sit at opposite ends of a problem without trying to win. And sometimes, when old habits surfaced and her tone sharpened or my distance grew colder than necessary, we paused, not perfectly, not always kindly, but consciously. Because consciousness was the one thing we had sworn never to lose again. There were moments when I looked at her across the dinner table and felt a tenderness that surprised me. Not the reckless kind that blinds, but the sober kind that sees clearly and stays anyway. And there were other moments when I felt nothing romantic at all. Only partnership, respect, shared responsibility. And I learned that love does not have to be dramatic to be real. It simply has to be chosen without illusion. Amelia carried her past differently now. Not as a wound she hid or a weapon she wielded, but as a scar she acknowledged when needed and then moved past. And that change did not come from my forgiveness but from her own reckoning. From realizing that the person she nearly lost was not me but herself. The version of her capable of being trusted by her children. Capable of standing in a room without needing admiration to feel whole. She began volunteering at Lily's school. Not to perform motherhood but to inhabit it. She showed up for No's games even when work pulled at her. And when she failed, because she still did sometimes, she apologized without explaining. A small act that meant more than grand gestures ever could. I watched my children grow into people who spoke their feelings plainly. Who did not flinch from honesty. Who trusted that home was a place where truth would not be punished. And I knew then that whatever damage had been done had stopped with us. That it had not passed through bloodlines the way unhealed pain so often does. There came a quiet evening. Years later, when Amelia asked me if I regretted staying. Not with fear, not with guilt, but with genuine curiosity. And I answered without hesitation that I regretted nothing about the way I had handled it. That whether we stayed married or not had never been the point. The point had been becoming someone my children could look at without confusion. Without having to untangle love from fear. And she nodded, accepting that answer without needing it to reassure her. And in that acceptance I saw the final proof of her growth. We did not celebrate anniversaries with extravagance. We did not pretend our story was inspirational. But we lived it with integrity. And integrity, I learned, is not loud. It does not announce itself. It simply endures. If our marriage survived, it was because it was rebuilt without lies. And if it ever ended, it would do so without cruelty. Because the affair had taught us something neither of us wanted to learn the hard way. That love without respect is fragile. That desire without accountability is destructive. And that children do not need perfect parents. They need present ones. Looking back now, I do not frame myself as the man who was betrayed, but as the man who chose not to be defined by it. Who refused to collapse or retaliate or disappear. Who stood still long enough for the truth to lose its power over him. Amelia's office affair did not ruin my life. It burned away what was false in hers. And while that fire nearly took everything, it also revealed what could not be destroyed. The quiet strength of dignity. The resilience of children who were protected instead of burdened. And a future built not on fantasy but on choice. This is not a story about forgiveness as salvation or marriage as victory. It is a story about restraint, about clarity, about knowing when to stand firm and when to step back, about understanding that happiness is not found in escape but in responsibility willingly carried. And if there is a lesson in the aftermath, it is this: betrayal only destroys those who refuse to face it honestly. The rest of us move forward, altered but intact, breathing freely, grounded in the knowledge that even when something almost breaks a family, it does not get to decide who survives whole. There is a point, long after the damage has been assessed and the repairs have either held or failed, when you stop telling the story to yourself as a warning and start holding it as context. And that was when I knew the affair no longer lived in our house. It lived only in memory, filed away like a document you keep not because you need it every day but because it explains how you arrived where you are. Amelia no longer flinched when the subject came up indirectly. In movies or in friends' divorces or in the hushed confessions people sometimes make when they think shared pain creates intimacy. And she never defended herself anymore. Never minimized. Never reframed. She simply acknowledged. And acknowledgement, I learned, is the quiet opposite of shame. Our home grew into itself again. Not into the version it had been before but into something more honest. More breathable. Where laughter came easily and silence was not a threat. And the children carried no secrets. No roles they hadn't chosen. No responsibility for adult fractures that were never theirs to hold. Lily left for college with confidence instead of guilt. Noah grew into a young man who trusted calm over chaos. And when they came home they did so without bracing themselves. Without scanning faces for emotional weather. And that was the proof I needed that we had done something right. Amelia and I aged together without illusion. Without pretending passion would always look the same. Without asking each other to be saviors. And in that realism there was a freedom neither of us had known before. Because nothing was being performed. Nothing was being hidden. And when love showed up it did so quietly. In shared routines. In mutual respect. In the unspoken understanding that staying was always a choice. Never an obligation. There were days I looked at her and felt gratitude. Not for surviving the affair, but for the woman she had become after she stopped running from herself. And there were days I felt neutrality. Peace without romance. And I accepted both because maturity teaches you that fulfillment is not constant intensity. It is sustained alignment. If one day our paths were to diverge, I knew it would happen without devastation. Because we had already survived the worst version of loss. The loss of trust. And learned how to live without destroying each other in the process. People sometimes ask how I knew when to stop being angry, how I knew when to forgive, and I tell them the truth. I didn't stop being angry all at once. I stopped feeding it. I forgave not because the damage was undone, but because holding onto resentment was costing me the very peace I had worked to protect for my children. Forgiveness did not erase the past. It simply removed its authority over the present. And that distinction changed everything. Amelia's affair did not make me smaller. It forced me to grow clearer, more disciplined, more grounded in who I was and what I would tolerate. And clarity, once earned, is something no one can take from you in the end. This is not a story about a marriage that almost ended or a woman who almost lost everything. It is a story about choice, about how dignity is built moment by moment, about how children flourish when adults refuse to collapse, about how betrayal does not have to be contagious. My wife's office affair destroyed her illusions, her shortcuts, her belief that desire could replace responsibility. But it did not destroy me. And it did not destroy our children. Because I chose steadiness over spectacle, boundaries over revenge, presence over escape, and that choice, repeated quietly over years, became a life that no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. A life that stood on its own, intact, honest, and at peace, which is the only kind of happy ending that ever truly lasts. When I look back now, from the distance that only years can provide, what strikes me most is not the affair itself, but how ordinary the days around it eventually became. Because healing does not announce itself with milestones or revelations. It reveals itself in the absence of fear, in the way you stop bracing for impact, in the way your body forgets to stay tense in rooms that once felt unsafe. There was a morning, unremarkable in every visible way, when I realized I no longer checked Amelia's tone for hidden meaning, no longer tracked her movements for signs of withdrawal, no longer felt the need to monitor the emotional temperature of the house. And that realization came with no celebration, only a quiet relief, the kind that settles into your bones and stays. Amelia noticed it too, not because I told her, but because I stopped asking certain questions, stopped waiting for certain answers. And she understood, finally, that trust had not returned as a favor. It had returned because she had lived in a way that allowed it to. Day after day, without performance, we grew older together in the unromantic but deeply satisfying way that comes from shared responsibility. From showing up when no one is watching. From choosing each other without the desperation of fear or the illusion of rescue. There were still disagreements, still moments of friction, but they no longer carried the weight of existential threat. They were simply two adults navigating a life neither of us pretended was perfect. Amelia stopped chasing versions of herself she could never sustain and began inhabiting the one she actually was. Flawed, capable, accountable, and I stopped measuring my worth through her attention, finding instead a steadiness that belonged to me alone. Our home became a place where emotions were named instead of managed, where silence was restful instead of ominous, and the children moved through it with an ease that told me more than any therapist ever could as Lily built her own relationships. She came to me once, asking quietly how to know when love was healthy, and I told her what I had learned the hard way. That love should never require you to shrink, that it should never ask you to betray yourself to keep it, and that if you feel afraid to speak, You are already being harmed." She listened carefully, not with fear but with clarity. And I knew then that whatever pain she had witnessed had been transformed into wisdom instead of damage. Noah, in his own way, learned that strength is not loud. That masculinity does not need domination. That walking away from chaos is not weakness but discernment. And watching him carry that understanding into his own life felt like closing a circle I hadn't known I was drawing. Amelia once told me, years after everything had settled, that losing my blind devotion had been the most painful consequence of her affair. More painful than shame, more painful than fear, because it forced her to earn respect instead of assuming it. And I did not take pleasure in that admission. I took responsibility, because love that is given without conditions is not always love. Sometimes it is avoidance. Sometimes it is fear of loss masquerading as loyalty. What replaced it was something far more honest. A partnership where neither of us was hidden. Where neither of us was sacrificed for the comfort of the other. And where staying together was always a conscious act. Not a default setting. If this story sounds calm now, that is because calm was fought for. Chosen repeatedly over drama, defended against old habits and easy escapes. And I am aware that not every story ends this way. That sometimes people do not change. That sometimes leaving is the healthiest choice. And I would have made that choice without hesitation if Amelia had continued down the path she started. That knowledge, held quietly but firmly, was part of what kept us honest. Because love without the option to leave is not commitment. It is captivity. The affair did not teach me how to forgive blindly. It taught me how to stand firmly in my own values while remaining open to change. And that balance is what preserved everything that mattered. So when I say my wife's office affair destroyed her, I do not mean it ruined her life. I mean it dismantled the false self she had been clinging to. The one built on validation and escape. And destruction, when faced directly, can be the beginning of something truer. It did not destroy me, because I refused to abandon myself. And it did not destroy our children, because I chose to shield them from adult chaos without lying to them about reality. What survived was not perfection, not romance, not an inspirational myth, but something far rarer. A family that learned how to tell the truth, how to hold boundaries, how to remain whole even when something nearly tore us apart. And that is where this story rests. Not in triumph, not in regret, but in quiet certainty. The certainty that dignity is a practice. That happiness is built, not found. And that even when betrayal enters a home, it does not get to decide who is ruined, unless you let it. The ending of this story did not arrive with a dramatic choice or a single defining moment. It arrived the way most real endings do. Gradually, almost invisibly, until one day you realize you are no longer waiting for anything to resolve. Because it already has. Amelia and I reached a point where the past no longer needed to be processed, analyzed, or revisited, not because it was erased but because it had been fully absorbed. Its lessons folded into the fabric of who we were. And when something becomes part of you instead of something you carry, it stops weighing you down. We were no longer a couple recovering from an affair. We were simply two adults who had learned, painfully and thoroughly, how to live without lying to ourselves. And that shift changed everything. There was no grand renewal of vows, no public declaration of triumph, Just a steady, mutual understanding that whatever we continued to build would be built with eyes open. With exits visible but unused. With choice reaffirmed rather than assumed. Emilia found peace not in reclaiming what she had lost but in accepting what she could never have again. The innocence of entitlement, the comfort of being unquestioned. And in that acceptance she grew lighter. Not freer in the reckless sense, but freer in the grounded sense. Able to love without chasing affirmation. Able to mother without resentment. Able to sit in her own life without needing to escape it. I watched her laugh more easily. Apologize more quickly. Listen more deeply. And I knew that whether we stayed together until the end of our lives or not, she would never again be the woman who risked everything for a feeling that could not last. As for me, I learned that strength is not endurance without limits. It is discernment. It is knowing when to stay and when you are willing to leave. And choosing to stay only when it does not cost you your self-respect. Our children carried none of the weight we once feared they would. Lily grew into a woman who trusted her voice, who chose partners carefully, who never mistook intensity for intimacy. And when she thanked me once for not falling apart, I understood that what children remember is not perfection but presence. Not promises but patterns. Noah became a man who did not confuse control with confidence. Who understood that walking away from chaos is sometimes the bravest act. And watching him move through the world without bitterness felt like the clearest confirmation that the damage had stopped with us. They did not inherit our wounds, because we refused to make them caretakers of adult pain. And that refusal shaped their futures more than any speech ever could in the quiet years that followed. When friends divorced, when acquaintances whispered about affairs and betrayals with a mix of fascination and fear, I never felt the urge to explain our story or defend our choices. Because it no longer needed justification. The truth was simple and steady. Betrayal had entered our home. But it did not get to define it. It destroyed Emilia's illusions, her shortcuts, her belief that she could live without consequence. And that destruction, though brutal, became the foundation of her growth. It did not destroy me, because I refused to abandon my values in response to someone else's failure. And it did not destroy our children, because I chose stability over spectacle, honesty over drama, dignity over revenge. If this ending sounds quiet, it is because peace rarely announces itself. It settles, it stays, it shows up in ordinary mornings, in unguarded laughter, in the absence of fear, in the certainty that whatever happens next, you will meet it without losing yourself. That is the ending we earned. Not a fairy tale, not a miracle, but something far more real. A life intact, a family whole, a woman transformed by facing herself, a man strengthened by refusing to break, and children who grew up knowing that even when adults fail, love does not have to collapse with them. And that, finally, is the truth of it. My wife's office affair destroyed her false self. Not me, not our children, and what survived was everything that truly mattered. That's the end of today's story. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment with your thoughts. Like the video, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you.